Hello, and thank you for joining us. My name is Dr. Steven Parissien, and I'm Director of Gainsborough's House Museum here in Suffolk. Firstly, I'd like to start by thanking Art UK for giving us this opportunity to share with you just a few of the delights of Gainsborough's house. And secondly, I'd like to, in the next few minutes, just go through with you some of what I think are the highlights of our collection, not just of Thomas Gainsborough, but other classic British artists too. We start with our main entrance. The Gainsborough House Museum comprises Thomas Gainsborough's birthplace, where he was born in 1727, but also includes, as we see here, a wonderful new wing, which includes new environmentally controlled galleries, an education centre, and wonderful new visitor facilities, all of which was opened just about a year ago. The architects were ZMMA, and I'm delighted to say we've won a number of architectural awards already. What we wished and what ZMMA delivered was an extension that fulfilled our requirements for exhibitions, for visitor enjoyment, but also fitted into the dense urban Georgian grain of the town of Sudbury. And I think they've done it very well indeed. It's recognisably contemporary, as you can see, but also very much phrased in a historic idiom with traditional materials, traditional forms, rhythms, reflecting the surrounding townscape. So a super job. So we've not just got wonderful pictures to come and see, but please do come for the architecture too. Here we have an overhead view from the wonderful new extension of our historic site, and you can see how it fits in to the town of Sudbury. In fact, for those of you who know Gainsborough's works, we're looking across south from the centre of the town of Sudbury to the spot by the former oak tree. Sadly, that oak tree is gone, where Gainsborough painted early in his career that iconic picture, Mr. and Mrs. Andrews, which is now in the National Gallery, that we hope to be borrowing for Gainsborough's anniversary. It's a splendid site. It's always sunny, of course, in Sudbury. It never rains. As you can see, straight ahead of you is Gainsborough's original home, and in the middle, a recreation of how the garden might have looked in Gainsborough's day, complete with a quince tree, a medlar tree, and of course a mulberry tree. And I'll come back to the importance of mulberry-made silk in a minute. So Thomas Gainsborough was born here in 1727, the fifth son, ninth child of John and Mary Gainsborough. We'll look at his career in a minute, but just to recap how we got here. After Gainsborough's death in 1788, sadly, the house you see ahead of you passed out of family ownership, and went through a number of guises, including a shop, finally rescued from complete irreversible refurbishment or indeed demolition in the 1950s. And we opened as a museum in 1961. The major extension that this photo is taken from was opened, as I say, just last year in 2022. And it's really transformed what we can do and what we can offer the visitor and what we can offer in terms of events, educational activities, you name it. We can do it now with our wonderful, wonderful new premises. Here's the front of the old house. So this is further south than that previous view. Here we are in the main street, Gainsborough Street, rather appropriately. Sudbury is a fine Georgian town, in fact, fine medieval town. We're looking down the road towards some wonderful medieval buildings. Gainsborough's home was originally two late medieval houses, refronted as the Georgians often did in the early 1720s, and that's what you're looking at now on the right here at 46 Gainsborough Street. The town of Sudbury was built on textile trade. We're very near famous wall towns of the 15th century. You can tell how successful they are by just looking at their wonderful churches. Lavenham is close by. So Sudbury acted as a major centre for textile production using that wool. The pattern changed in the early 19th century when a number of silk weavers from London, often Huguenot artisans, such as indeed my ancestors, moved to Sudbury to set up new works in what was a very congenial spot with lots of workmanship and lots of tradesmen who knew how to work with textiles. And really, since the early 19th century, it's that textile trade, and importantly, it's the silk trade that has made Sudbury, and one has to say, the figure of Thomas Gainsborough too. Today, Sudbury is still Britain's silk capital. Over 80% of Britain's silk is made in Sudbury, including a lot of the silk you saw in the coronation of King Charles III recently. So when you come, please do not just visit us, but please come and visit at least one of the wonderful silk factories that still survives today, a wonderful Georgian tradition. So it was in this house that Thomas Gainsborough grew up. He was recognized from, well, the age of 12 or 13 as an outstanding artist, someone with great promise, not an incipient silk weaver, not someone who continued the family's textile trade. And around the age of 12 or 13, he was sent to London to develop his talent. How did they do this? Well, it wasn't a rich family, despite the handsome facade you're looking at now. In fact, the Gainsboroughs weren't well-to-do. Thomas's father, John, had sadly lost all the family money and was in dire straits. And the temporary move to London was only made possible really by a rather melodramatic moment. The murder by footpads of his uncle, Thomas. Thomas left a will stating that my executors should take care of Thomas Gainsborough, his nephew, that he may be brought up to some light handicraft trade likely to get a comfortable maintenance. So thanks to his uncle's money, he was able to visit London and indeed establish the beginnings of a very comfortable maintenance. He came back to Sudbury and lived, particularly after his father's death in 1748, in this house, only finally leaving for good for the fashionable watering hole of Bath and for the many patrons he could use for his burgeoning portrait business in 1752. The first of the items from our wonderful collection I'm going to select is just a marvelously typical, joyous, fun picture. Gainsborough was all about fun. He was not a bookish recluse like some of his contemporaries. He enjoyed going out and about in so many ways. And here's another chap. We don't know who he is. We think we know. I'll say that in a minute. But it's an early portrait of around 1746 of a gentleman with a dog, set against a background of a local wood. And that's really, so this was a local chap. And what's really important is looking at the style that we see here. Gainsborough's portrait painting, as we'll see, developed during his career. But what's astonishing is that from the very word go, Thomas Gainsborough shows a tremendous facility with landscape painting. I mean, where does this come from? There's no real artistic skill in his family. And there's no landscape tradition really in Britain at all before Thomas Gainsborough. The great landscapes that everyone admired were 17th century works of great French and Dutch masters. Gainsborough's talent is astonishing, and his facility with landscape is really unprecedented and really lays the foundation for British landscape painting. The gentleman here, well, we don't actually know who he is. For many years, it was thought to be the poet William Cowper, but everyone always puts a famous name on someone, don't they? We think now it may be a member of the local Throckmorton family. and indeed, as we'll see in the early years of his practice, as with so many would-be artists, Gainsborough needs to paint local worthies to enable him to make enough money to be able to paint landscapes, which not many people are buying. Throckmorton, if that is indeed him, is here wearing a plain but fashionable tricorn hat, in contrast to his extravagant yellow waistcoat with silver lace trimmings. Very much a fashion in the 1740s. Remember, we're in wartime here in 1746, in the middle of the War of the Austrian Succession, Dettingen, the last battle in which a British monarch led his army. The waistcoat is in the manner of a cavalryman, a hussar. So it's very much a la mode, very fashionable. And we have, of course, a wonderful dog. Gainsborough's very good at dogs. He likes dogs. We'll see another dog or two later on. The brown and white spaniel here is both fun and both clearly belongs to his master, and also fits into that symbolic tradition of the dog as an emblem of faith and fidelity. Here we have one of Gainsborough's early landscapes, and as I said before, it's astonishing the facility with which even the young Thomas Gainsborough, so he's around 1920 at this time, really astonishingly mature landscape for one so young who is self-taught. He was certainly helped in London, aged 12 and 13, but how sophisticated, how mature. He really does capture the local landscape of Suffolk where he lived. Also, there's a big sky. Often we associate these wonderful big skies with a later generation of artists, notably John Constable. We have a wonderful Constable collection here. But here you can see Gainsborough paying real attention to the sky, as indeed would his subjects, the local farmers, both artist and farmer, very much dependent and fascinated by what goes on up above. The idea of this picture, I think, comes from one of those Dutch 17th century landscapes that Gainsborough and his contemporaries so admired. But again, just to emphasize, Gainsborough is able to do this because he makes his money from portraits. At the time, certainly early in his career, people aren't buying his landscapes necessarily. This is what he simply likes to do. The central focus of the picture is a country wagon, ancestor, if you like, of Constable's famous hay wain of 1821. You'll see this country wagon in a lot of Gainsborough's landscapes. Here it leads us through the undulating landscape, through to the middle ground, on to the distant horizon. This painting would have been executed in Gainsborough's studio, but a lot of the original sketching and colour sketching in oils may have been done in the open air. Open air painting is not discovered by the French Impressionists. We know we have surviving little paint bladders in our museum, little bladders containing oil paints, which Gainsborough took out with him. So portable paints are a really important step forward in enabling artists like Gainsborough and his successors, people like Constable and Turner, to paint outdoors. Here's a more sophisticated later portrait of around 1763. It's a wonderful picture, isn't it? I mean, it's not flattering, except in that it shows a very assured woman, someone who's comfortable in her own skin. The subject is Harriet, Lady Tracy, Viscountess Tracy, a member of the Bathurst family, which dominated the West Country in the middle of the 18th century. So this was a picture from Gainsborough's Bath years. In 1755, Harriet married Charles Tracy, who shortly afterwards inherited a title and an estate from his father. Worth saying, thanks to the Arts Council's wonderful acceptance in lieu scheme, we've been able to acquire a portrait of her husband recently. So please come to the gallery and see the couple reunited on the wall, very fittingly. Harriet's family seat was in Gloucestershire. Sadly, that's demolished. That was demolished in the 19th century. The pose here goes back way further. Gainsborough was a huge admirer, as we'll see, of Anthony van Dyck, the great court painter of the 1630s. And he's ostentatiously quoting a famous Van Dyck pose, one of Van Dyck's court sitters, in this case, Lady Mary of Villiers, in this portrait of a West Country worthy. So Harriet, well, it's a wonderful picture, isn't it? She's not a society beauty, but she's got a poise there that you don't often see in female portraits of this era. Interestingly, a recent X-ray revealed that the black choker you see was actually covering a row of pearls. So my guess is that Harriet, who was, as you can guess from her expression, was a modest person. While she may have posed with the pearls, afterwards she probably thought, oh, gives the wrong impression, a bit too ostentatious. So out they go. Jolly important little picture. This is a little oil by Gainsborough of Ignatius Sancho, a writer, musical composer. You may have heard some of his work on Radio 3. Importantly, a campaigner for the abolition of slavery and a good friend of Thomas Gainsborough. Sancho had a fascinating career, sold into slavery in a Spanish colony. His owner gifted him to 3 sisters in Greenwich, who brought him up as a free person. He then worked for and was supported by the Duke of Montagu in Blackheath, and began to write and publish, a man of huge talent. And indeed, when Gainsborough knew him, he was one of the most influential voices calling for the abolition of the slave trade. In 1774, he opened a shop in Mayfair in fashionable London, which sold items produced by West Indian slaves. Fascinating, just to raise the idea of the plight of the slaves. And he also, in the same year, became the first British African to vote in a British general election, so a real pioneer. 2 British abolitionists of the day. Sancho became a marvelous example of the humanity of Africans and of the immorality of the slave trade and of slavery. Sancho advised the Whig politician Charles James Fox, who himself was to eventually introduce the parliamentary bill that outlawed slavery in 1807. 2 years after Ignatius's death in 1780, his letters of the late Ignatius Sancho, an African, were published to great acclaim. Sadly, Sancho was not able to see the posthumous success of his great work. And now, as they say, for something completely different, here is, well, an old horse, and it is an old horse. This is a plaster model, once in the possession of the great Suffolk artist John Constable, which survives today in our Constable room. So please come and see it. We also have brass models of it as well for sale. Around 1755, Gainsborough painted an engaging sketch of an old horse, described in a later catalogue as an aged cart horse, much emaciated and just taken from work. So by no means a racehorse, a horse at the end of his working life, looking forward to his retirement. Gainsborough, for his sketch, took his inspiration from a plaster model of an old horse, which he bought when he was training in London in the 1740s. And subsequently, his use of this plaster model of a horse created, as a friend recalled, a call in the plaster shops from an old horse that Gainsborough modelled, which has particular merit. John Constable, an artist really from the next generation of those great British artists, born in 1776, was a huge admirer of Gainsborough and was particularly fond of his old horse sketch, so much so that he bought one of the plaster replicas of Gainsborough's plaster model for his own studio. It's this replica, owned by Gainsborough, that we see here. And here we have a very well-known portrait, which we have in our collection. This is called The Pitminster Boy, a wonderful, wonderful portrait. For many years, it was attributed to, well, a variety of people, but we're pretty sure now that the Pitminster Boy is indeed Gainsborough's nephew and studio apprentice, Gainsborough Dupont. the eldest son of Gainsborough's sister, Sarah, and Philip Dupont. Dupont was apprenticed to Gainsborough from 1772 until the year of his uncle's death in 1788. Today, however, he's probably best known not as an artist in his own right, but as he was, but as the model for Gainsborough's celebrated and timeless Blue Boy, now, of course, on the far coast of California. Gainsborough, unlike some of his contemporaries, like Sir Joshua Reynolds, didn't have a studio full of assistants. Dupont was the only assistant that Gainsborough ever employed. Once again, though, this is also about Gainsborough's homage to Anthony van Dyck, the artist he so admired. In fact, this very portrait was on Gainsborough's easel when he died. And it's said that the artist's last words as he expired were, "Van Dyck was right." Here we have an extremely emotive picture of called The Artist's Daughter, Mary. The saga of the artist, Thomas Gainsborough, and his daughters is a poignant one. And certainly looking at his portraits of his daughters now, in hindsight, when we know of their rather sad and tragic lives, it becomes sometimes almost unbearably emotional. This is a portrait of Mary, known by the family as Molly, painted when Mary was in her late 20s. Again, here's in her dress and her pose, Gainsborough's looking back to 17th century models, not in this case Van Dyck, but Van Dyck's great hero, Peter Paul Rubens. Intimate portraits like this, obviously Gainsborough is not painting these for money. These are, again, pictures he just wants to paint. They're simple, they're affecting, and well, I certainly find them very, very moving. You'll see some other wonderful pictures of his daughters in the National Gallery in London. Mary's life was, again, one rather unfulfilled and one that ended up rather sadly. A few years after this portrait was painted, she entered into a disastrous short-lived marriage with the celebrated oboist, Johann Christian Fischer. Gainsborough knew a lot of musicians, amateur musician himself. He got on with Fischer. He was a friend of Fischer's. But Gainsborough realized that his daughter really shouldn't marry the wayward Fischer. And indeed, he was right. He tried to stop the match. He wrote to his own sister, "I've never suffered that worthy gentleman, Mr. Fischer, ever to be in my daughter's company since I came to London." But nevertheless, she disobeyed her father, married him, and the marriage collapsed after 6 months. Johann Fischer was not the marrying kind, shall we say. After that, Mary's mental health began to deteriorate very sadly, and she was increasingly cared for by her younger and more responsible younger sister, Margaret, with whom she lived, who you can also see at our gallery. After Margaret's death in 1820, very sadly, Mary spent her last 6 years in a mental institution, a very sad end to a very promising life of someone incredibly talented. From poignancy, let's go back to the dogs. This is a wonderful doggy picture, isn't it? A Pomeranian bitch and puppy, it's called. We'll talk about the name in a minute. Gainsborough painted dogs not just as props, if you like, adjuncts to his people, but also as individuals in their own right, and often as real characters. His understanding and love of dogs, you can tell that from looking at this picture, can't you? And it's an affectionate portrait of Pomeranian dogs owned by his close friend, another musician friend, the musician Carl Friedrich Abel, the last of the great viola da gamba geniuses. Gainsborough described Abel as the man I loved from the moment I heard him touch the string. Interestingly, these very handsome dogs, we wouldn't call Pomeranians today, and you can see the effect of modern dog breeding on what were Pomeranians. We now describe them as German Spitz dogs, descended themselves from Nordic herding dogs, and originally imported from northern Germany, in which the province of Pomerania then lay, really since the 16th century. Modern pet Pomeranian dogs, however, are far smaller than this and with shorter muzzles and ears, so it's not like a modern version. Our last image, well, shows the dogs in context with two of our delightful visitors. In our splendid Gainsborough gallery, as well as exhibition galleries, we have a constantly refreshed Gainsborough gallery in our new wing. And here we have Gainsborough's Pomeranians against a background of wonderful green silk. So bringing together perhaps the two iconic heritage elements present in Sudbury's history, Thomas Gainsborough and the silk industry. The wonderful silk you're looking at was very kindly donated by Humphreys Weaving, one of the great silk factories still surviving in modern day Sudbury. So please come and see the silk, come and see our galleries, please come and see our wonderful collection and our splendid exhibitions.